quickly start the next session, the duration for which will be about an hour and a half. So it's a great honor to introduce Darshana, who will be speaking today. Darshana is a researcher at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, India, and is tracking and analyzing developments in the Indo-Pacific region. She's also a visiting fellow at the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy and a 2016 National Parliamentary Fellow Australia, looking at India-Australia maritime ties in the Indo-Pacific. At the Australian Parliament, she's associated with the office of the Honourable Mrs. Teresa Gambaro, Member of Parliament and Chair, Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. Darshana works on India's foreign policy and maritime strategy, focusing on the Indo-Pacific region. She writes regularly on maritime issues such as India's naval strategy, India's naval engagement with the region, geopolitical developments in the Indian Ocean region, India's maritime strategic outlook, and the South China Sea. Her project also looks at the strategic implications of China's infrastructure and connectivity projects in the Indian Ocean region. In her past professional work with the Observer Research Foundation, Darshana was the associate editor of the South China Sea Monitor, a monthly bulletin that curated and analyzed developments in the region. Darshana also completed a Master's in International Relations from the Cardiff University in 2012 with a thesis on South China Sea, the changing power dynamics, and has previously worked with the Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, IDSA Delhi, and the United Nations Association Wales. So with that, again, we'd like to welcome you to Jindal Global University and the program, and the floor, please do
Thank you.
Enlighten us with your ideas. Yeah.
Thank you. I was here last year exactly around this time, I think for the batch before yours, giving a similar talk on topic. So today, when Sean got in touch, he wanted me to provide an overview of the developments in the South China Sea. I don't know what courses you are doing or if you've had much interaction on maritime security and the South China Sea, but he said to give an overview of the South China Sea and India and Australia's policies. So have you guys had any kind of a briefing on these issues? Yeah? So you're aware of the situation in the South China Sea and the maritime domain. I mean, based on that, I will kind of alter my presentation. I wouldn't go into the, introductory details of it if you are aware of the basic disputes and, yeah, no? Okay, I'll just provide a... Yeah? Okay, I'll just provide a brief introduction of the environment in the South China Sea, and this has been going on for a long time, but it escalated in 2012, but now we are in a very different environment, and what are its repercussions for the regional security architecture, and specifically I'll touch on India and Australia's policies toward this issue. So the South China Sea is important primarily because it's a main trading route connecting the powerhouses of Southeast Asia. So you talk about Japan, Korea, China, to Europe, to Middle East, to the rest of the world. So that is the route that is taken by not just Southeast Asia, but all of the imports going in and out from Indian Ocean to the Western Pacific. So from an Indian statistic point of view, 55% of our trade goes through that route. So that's a big number. So now the South China Sea has littorals, but there are a few islands within the South China Sea that are claimed. They are claimed by different countries, and these islands fall under the international trade route. That means those waters can be accessed by all commercial ships by any country because that's international waters. So what happened was in 1947, China had released a map called the 11-dash line, which is really a U-shaped line which covers about 88% of the entire South China Sea. Then in 1949, they knocked off 2 dashes and they called it the 9-dash line, which is how it stands right now, where they say anything and everything that falls within those lines belong to China. So that's 88% of waters, international waters, that should have access to everybody. Now, the problem does not arise if it's commercial shipping, because countries never try and stop commercial ships from moving because trade is interdependent, but it is mostly for the movement of military ships that countries try and oppose. So in the 9-dash line that China created, there are specifically some islands which are disputed by 6 countries. So that's China, Vietnam, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei, who have competing claims over similar islands. But these islands are very strategic because the area is wide, and access and control over these islands would give you kind of the capability to project military power across the South China Sea. Now, under international law, you guys done some amount of international maritime law, UNCLOS. So under international law, you have 12 nautical miles, which is your territorial sea. That is, the host country has absolute right and power over that area, and any other country who wants to go through those waters will have to take prior permission. Then you have the next 200 nautical miles zone, which is what is adhered as exclusive economic zone. So the host country has rights over it, but other countries can also have economic rights in there, such as mining or exploitation fisheries, but in consultation with the host countries. Now, there is a dispute in terms of views between what we call the Western nations and the Eastern and the rest of the world, where countries primarily led by the US say that even military ships and commercial ships have a right to go through another country's 200 nautical mile zone, which is the exclusive economic zone, whereas countries on this side of the world say that, no, you have to take prior permission. Now, it's about China and India are actually on the same side on this, and about 22 Asian countries who say that another country needs permission to go through my exclusive economic zone. But there are varying degrees of how much you how you adhere to that, and what actions you take if a third country goes through those specifically 200 nautical mile zones. Now, the entire dispute is based on that, because the islands that are in the South China Sea, and with each island, if you generate 200 nautical mile zones, say, there's the U-shaped line, and within that there are 6 or 7 islands, and each island generates about 200 nautical mile zones. So under the law that China abides by, the entirety of the South China Sea becomes their territorial waters. So that means any ship, any movement, be it commercial or military, would have to take prior permission from China to enter those waters. So that is a legal dispute. In 2013, Philippines took China to a permanent court of arbitration within the UN, and challenged China's legal claims to that. A lot happened between 2013 and 2016 when the judgment was passed. China refused to participate in the case. Now, UN is not binding. It's not binding. It doesn't have an army of its own to impose its decisions. So it has to be on goodwill of the countries and your respect for international norms and law. Between 2013 and 2016, China began drastically building those islands up. Some of those islands were really reefs that could not be seen during high tide, so they were really submerged in water. What China did was they reclaimed land from undersea and created islands that could, and built jetties and aircraft landing strips where your military ships could land, and really turning them into military and strategic assets. And by 2016, in one of the biggest islands, they also deployed their missiles, which would go out of the region. So they really militarized the entire entire dispute. So, and China is not the first one to have built those islands. Actually, China was last in the game. Vietnam had already done it and Taiwan had already done it. But none of the islands that were developed could support military engagement or military presence. Only the ones that China did could, and within a year and a half, they completely transformed those islands, and they've built hospitals there. They've built libraries there. They've built airports there. They're no humans. There's no. It's not habited. So this is under international law that if you fortify it, then you have a right to defend it, saying, look, I have my crew there. I have my citizens there. So it is my right to defend it. But there is no civilian population in most of these islands. But there are buildings. There are buildings to support schools and hospitals. There are buildings for the military bases. Within that time, because there was a lot of reaction from the region on the scale in which China was kind of building up these islands, that the United States started something called the Freedom of Navigation Operations. They call it the FONOPS. It's not new. It's every country's been doing it for ages, but then they just termed it in connection to the South China Sea dispute, where a U.S. said that I will not recognize I will not recognize your claims, and that I have a free right to go through these waters, the 200 nautical mile zones. So thereby really opposing, challenging China's claims and saying, I don't need your permission, and sailed through those waters. Now it has been done by all other countries. It's happened. Australia does it all the time. India does it all the time. But when India, Australia do it, they go on their visits to other countries, because you have to access these waters if you want to go to any Southeast Asian countries. So on the other side of Malacca Straits, you go to Indonesia, from Japan to any country, you have to go to these waters. So of course, for any naval deployments, any commercial ships, you had to access these waters. China would from time to time block the ships and say, you're in Chinese territory, please leave immediately. But you keep going on. There were some very provocative incidents where they come really close to the ship and then they stop. You don't know if they are going to crash or not. There have been times where they have kind of shot water cannons at Philippines fishermen, or detained them, or rammed into their boats, patrol vessels. So a lot of provocative thing that fortunately nothing escalated to armed conflict, but it was always tense, because you don't know when who's going to react how. There have been also incidents when I think there was a US ship who was telling the Chinese ship approaching theirs that please stop, because you're going to crash into ours, and they didn't stop. So US in defense turned on their water hose for water cannons on the Chinese ship, and from what the story goes is, they stripped to the underwear and still kept coming. They said, you can't stop us, and then they just kept coming, and they stopped really close to the ship. Around 2013, they also established something called Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, which is basically saying that not just your ships, if your flights come over this area, you'll have to identify us too. So a lot of commercial ships actually changed routes. A lot did not. It still is in place, but China said that you can come into this area, but you'll have to submit your plans to me in advance so that I don't shoot down your aircrafts. So saying every commercial flight, who's going where, what are the routes they're taking, that had to be submitted. A lot of companies complied, a lot which had political support did not. It's still in place, but it's not really highly regarded. A lot of the countries have completely bypassed that. Then in 2016, when US started doing the freedom of navigation operations, that was the time when things were pretty heated. That was right after China deployed missiles on one of their islands, but US has never crossed the 12 nautical mile. That means they've never breached the territorial sovereign rights of China. So it never warranted a response that would actually bring it to a confrontational situation, but it wasn't it wasn't having much of an effect. It was more diplomatic rhetoric, and then U.S. reached out to its allies, including Australia and Japan and UK, too, saying that we should all together, in show of force and support, sail through these waters, showing that, that it's not just the US fighting against, it's all of us. But Australia declined, Japan declined, everybody declined. Nobody said we want to do a joint patrol against China, despite knowing that this affects every country. US came to India. India said that if we do something, we'll do it with ASEAN. We won't do it with the United States. And India also said that if your allies like Australia and Japan are not willing to stand by you, how are you even coming to us? So then US started saying, that reflects a lot in Donald Trump's speeches. They're saying that I will not carry the burden of my allies, that, if you're in the region, you have to pick up some of the work that needs to be done. If you want to protect your freedom of navigation and your right to access those waters, then you have to be willing to deploy to those waters and oppose what you think is wrong. Now, it gets tricky because of commercial ties with China. China is, I think, Australia's #1 trade partner. And from my understanding, there is a big divide within the Australian political community, where you're trying to balance it. Australia still does not stop going into those waters or flying, but it's not confrontational or opposed the way US has done it. For India, we have South China Sea is a secondary area of importance. Of what primary areas, Indian Ocean region. Second is that we have ongoing border dispute on a northern continental border with China. So India is a bit careful in pushing the buttons on the maritime domain, because you don't know what kind of reaction India will get on the continental spat. And it's India's dispute with China on the eastern continental front and Pakistan on the western continental front. And Pakistan and China are really good friends and partners, actually. And so India feels a bit cautious in speaking out. So India's policy initially on the South China Sea was very mute and diluted, and it was mostly saying we will respect international norms and rules. But by 2014, China started making frequent forays to the Indian Ocean region. They docked submarines in Colombo, which India considers its maritime environment, and that changed a lot of the maritime environment and India's outlook. By 2015, when we had a new government and Prime Minister Modi went to meet his counterparts in Southeast Asia or the US or Vietnam, the first thing he raised was that, South China Sea, that you can't get away with it. So India has raised its tone and the heat on it, but on action there wasn't much. India still said that India will not join any coordinated patrols with the Americans or any powers to challenge China, but will not shy away from deploying or engaging in Southeast Asia. India, in fact, turned its look east into act east, which is based on its naval diplomacy, so that it will keep going. But it tried to create a line saying it's not a policy to contain China, but as my reaction to what's happening in the region. By 2016, July, the UN Court of Arbitration, after all the hearing, they found that China's 9-dash line, the basis on which it is claiming the entirety of the South China Sea, does not have any legal rights, and that it should be dismissed. And for the international community, it should not respect it. And that it's invalid. That China's 9-dash line does not exist. It is invalid, and nobody has to adhere to it. And to that, China came out with a response saying that UN has no jurisdiction over this. It's because it's not international waters and it's China's domestic problem. So UN has no issue over it. That was a big a big milestone in the way where the maritime or the strategic environment is heading in the Indo-Pacific right now, because that was the first time a big power openly undermined the only international institution that we have, that everybody is a signatory to. China is a signatory to UNCLOS. It signed the treaty, and there was nothing that anybody could do about it. China said, I'm not going to. China said, your verdict doesn't mean anything to me, and there was nobody could do anything about it unless you go up to China and say, get into a fight and say this. And the verdict also that the China would have to dismantle all of the buildings and the weapons that it has placed in those islands, and that it would have to retreat. So who was going to make China do any of it? Who really was? The UN doesn't have an army of its own. None of the actors were willing to come together and send military force to ask China to withdraw. So there was nothing. There was no repercussion. There was, of course, moral ground. Did China lose it? Yes, they did. But it didn't change a single fact on the ground. China continued building. China has much more assets on the ground than it did since it stopped constructing for about, this came out in July, so they stopped until about October, November. They stopped constructing. They didn't have any new infrastructure come up, but right after that they resumed. It lost a lot of moral ground because countries then came out very sharply, but that was the extent of it. The extent of it was statements, political statements saying this is wrong, and that we urge China to respect it. You cannot disrespect international rules and norms, and it's UN. But that really was it. I mean, it's statements. And because it did not affect anybody's relationship with China, it definitely did not affect any of the trade or economic relationship with China. And it was something that countries had to work with, knowing that China is continuing on the path that it's going. And there's no way for us to stop it but to engage with China. So it really created a new norm for emerging disputes in the region, that, okay, there is a way that, UN is not the supranational body that, even if UN goes against me, I can still say, no, I'm not going to do it, because I can look at this big power and say that, hey, China didn't do it, I'm not going to do it either. So it created this new norm which threatened the entire international system as we had known as it existed. And around the same time, there was at the same tribunal court, Bangladesh had taken India on a similar dispute to the UN, where Bangladesh had said that they had large parts of the. So there was overlapping claims where basically whoever wins gets more territory in the maritime domain, and the other one loses. And the court ruled against India and in favor of Bangladesh. This was 2014, early 2015. So India accepted that ruling, and kind of so it redrew it's still going on. It's redrawing, but then it accepted to redraw its maps and give that portion that the tribunal awarded to Bangladesh. And Philippines took that up when it was making its case in the UN, that this was a similar thing between a big player and a smaller player, and that it's all up to your respect for goodwill and international norms. But it did not have any effect on. I mean, there was nothing physically. Physically, there was no stopping China from dismantling any of the construction that was being built. Now it has become a big issue in discussions when you talk about international relations or regional institutions, that what really is if you continue like in the manner that it is going, that where really are we headed? Do we rewrite all of the rules of engagements and the norms that we've known, or do we accept a new player and say, okay, this is an exception, the rest stays as it is? So it has complicated a lot of the way the maritime domain has been working. So now you see what scholars are calling it that a changing that a new regional architecture, that after the Cold War, this is how things were, everybody abided by it, but now it's being challenged, and you're being forced to debate new rules of engagement. You're being forced to look at things from a new perspective, and maybe create a new system in which you'll have to take into account things that have happened in the past that countries can actually uh, um, completely ignore and disobey the existing systems. And one of China's biggest, I think, argument was that why is the United States even saying that I should obey UNCLOS, because the United States has not signed that treaty. U.S. is not even a party to that treaty, but it does go around and say that you must be a party to that treaty. So it's a lot of imbalances, because when then China goes that when China is a bigger emerging power now, that how does a big power get away with it, and that U.S. despite not being a party to the treaty, it has the ground to go and ask other countries to abide by the rules that it's not even a signatory to. So every time the U.S. brings up that discussion or that point of reference with China, China has this one question, and there's literally no answer from the American diplomats, and the conversation stops there. Now, U.S. has its own issues why it does not sign up to the treaty. That's a different debate, because because if they sign to the treaty, they lose access to a lot of the exclusive economic zone. So it's every country is basically working toward their own strategic interests and own catering to their domestic politics and catering to their to the policies that they have created. So the South China Sea is now considered what as the flashpoint that could create an armed conflict, because China considers those waters its own. A lot of the waters it has imposed its 12 nautical mile territorial waters. So when the seas are so vast that it is a possibility that sometimes ships stray away from the internationally recommended transit corridor, and it may go into what China considers its own territory. And when you have a foreign ship in your own territorial waters without prior permission, the host country reserves the right to expel that ship, or even like same with flights. Like if you don't have the information about a certain flight going over your air zone, you have the right to shoot it down. So it's similar that some miscalculation or misunderstanding could actually trigger off an armed conflict in the South China Sea, and by default the entire region is going to get dragged into it, because the U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines. That is, by legal terms, if the Philippines is ever attacked by China or comes under attack, the U.S. would have to come to its defense, and by USS alliance system, all of its allies come into the picture as well. Then, of course, you have other countries, and India and Vietnam has a very, very close relationship, and Vietnam has asked. So there is area in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, which is considered by China as its own territory, and India has a project going on there. So China regularly turns up and asks Indian citizens and civilians to leave, saying this is Chinese territory, but then it is Indian government and Vietnamese government's understanding to be there. So Indian Navy is deployed there to protect its own citizens. So some sort of misunderstanding and miscalculation could lead to that. Then you also have a dispute in the East China Sea, which is the Sea of Japan. So that is between China and Japan over the islands of Senkakus, where until 2012 it was privately owned by a Japanese national, to which China didn't have a problem, but then the citizen sold it to the government, so it became Japanese property. The moment it became Japanese territory, China raised questions about it. So you have two disputes, big disputes in close proximity that covers entire Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, which could trigger off some sort of a conflict that might escalate very, very quickly. So since the ruling, there hasn't been much development. China seems to have created a status quo that this is where things stand, that these islands stay, my assets on it stay, and the only The only pushback has been that most countries have refused to acknowledge the 200 nautical mile zone. So they're still sailing and they're still flying through those areas. But what it has given is it has given, not entirely, but because of its strategic locations in the islands in the South China Sea, it gives China access to cover the entire region in terms of a conflict. In terms of policies for India and Australia, I mean, I mentioned where in both India and Australia continue to engage on the issue, where they bring it up in major discussions and dialogues. It's a point of contention that is always raised, but um, when you talk to the Chinese delegation and they say there's an issue, and it's like you're saying, okay, there's an issue that we need to resolve, and China says, no, there isn't, because it's not a problem. So you run into like a dead wall. They say that's my territory. I don't understand what dispute. So China has never accepted that there is a dispute, because the moment you accept legally that there is a dispute, you're bound to resolve it. So China has never said there is a dispute. They said that the other countries are mistaken, and there is no dispute. This is China's sovereign right and territory, so there's nothing to be resolved. So they walk out of every meeting with every country saying there's no dispute to be resolved, so there's nothing to talk about. So it hasn't gone anywhere. So in 2001, the ASEAN tried to negotiate a code of conduct. They signed the Declaration of Code of Conduct, where it's not dispute resolution, but to create a system so that any misunderstanding or miscalculation does not arise, that you behave a certain way so that no ship collides with each other. There's no tension, not like minimizing tension. It's 2018. There's been no progress on that. So China does not agree. They have not been able to come to agreement even on a single clause. So they've signed the declaration, but there is no code of conduct as yet, and I don't see it happening in the near future or anytime soon. So there is nothing really in terms of I don't think so there is going back from here. There's only stopping from it getting or escalating, which would have to depend on coordination of efforts between the bigger powers in the region, which they're not willing to do right now because of their economic ties with China, and for their own domestic concerns or their resources and capabilities. For India was actually Japan was the U.S. and Japan were the first countries to have to release a statement really urging China to accept the ruling as soon as the ruling came out. And I think India came out of it immediately, and then it didn't take any side. It didn't say China should abide by it, but it said that we will only adhere to the we will function according to the ruling that has been released by the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and that is the status quo. So basically saying that we do not count the 9-dash line without naming 9-dash line or anything. EU tried to release a statement on it saying you have to respect international law and UN. I mean, you're debating whether to release a statement that UN is valid, and EU did not come to a consensus because of, you have these countries, they have the bilateral relationship with China, so you couldn't come to a consensus, so there was no statement. I think Australia took a few days before they could come to a consensus on the wording of what they should release. Number of countries did not come out with a statement in support or against of the ruling, because they just wanted to stay away from this entire debate. So the lack of voices also gives ground for a country to keep moving forward. Right, in terms of policies, I mean, it still is one of the biggest hotspots that could create your next war in the region, but there hasn't been much done on this right now. I mean, there's a CSIS, Center for Strategic and National Studies in DC. They have a program called Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. If you go to their website, you'll see they show. They have satellites that's tracking the developments of in the South China Sea, and it'll show they try and interpret what new infrastructures come up and what it means for the region. That if there's a new If there's a new infrastructure, does it elevate it to the level of a base? That means is it a military base, and what China can do from that region? If you go there, you would see what was the status of those islands in 2014 and what they are now. How they reclaimed land from the sea and actually turned that into islands. Because even under UNCLOS, there are clause on what can be given the status of an island, that it should have, these features and these components, and China built those to kind of, have that. So it's not something that any country can do. It requires a lot of resources. It requires a lot of capital. So there hasn't been any strong opposition. The smaller countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Philippines, primarily, they are still making rounds, gathering support, because it affects them more than it affects nor US, nor Australia, India are resident powers. It does not affect you from day to day, but it affects Vietnam, it affects Indonesia, it affects Philippines, because their coast guards and their navies run into these troubles. And these countries had also kind of said that, if at this time these powers cannot come to our aid, what is your role for being these major powers if you can't even provide the security that is required, or that 5 of you together can't even come up to one nation? And it affected relationships. But India's policy is that it will not get into any contain China mechanism, but it will continue engaging bilaterally with the country. So what they're doing now, I think it's a similar thing with Australia as well, that you are helping these countries build their own capabilities and capacity to defend their lines and their territory. So you're giving them patrol vessels, you're giving them ships, you're giving them lines of credit that will get their crew and their naval personnel training to do what to do in a situation like that. Also training in legal point of view, building assets, so that they can themselves, at least in the meantime, defend their territory, and at the same time increasing your engagement with those countries, so that your presence in that region increases, and which does not look like you are intimidated by a country's domestic laws or unilateral laws, and that you respect. So the only way to really keep questioning it is to undermine or not agree to the rules that China has established unilaterally, and follow the ones that have been established under UNCLOS and the UN. Now there is a fear that a similar situation is spilling over into the Indian Ocean region, but it is hard for something like that to spill over to the Indian Ocean region, because Indian Ocean region is a much wider community, a much bigger, and you don't have one single power that dominates the others. It's a range of bigger powers. You have from the eastern coast of Africa to the Malacca Straits. So you have from France to India to Indonesia to Germany to US. There are too many big powers for one country to dominate. And Indian Ocean is also an area which is considered as far seas for the Chinese. That means for them to be able to be present in these waters permanently, they need bases. And except for Djibouti, which came up last year, they don't have anything. I think next one is in Pakistan, which is in Gwadar. But they need more, because that is why there is a concern over all the infrastructure that is being built in the Indian Ocean region, that how quickly can they turn into strategic assets. So that's more or less the overview of the situation on the ground on South China Seas. I thought the rest we can interact, and if you have questions, maybe I can better explain or give you more details on what's going on.
In terms of the major 4-ish hotspots that are in the Asian region, with North Korea, Taiwan, the South and East China Sea, which one do you think has the most potential to trigger war?
I think depends. I mean, you have a regime in North Korea that nobody has any sense of. I mean, it's not even a part of the international system, so that is not going to. I mean, North Korea is not really going to count about its moral standing or or its relationship with the rest of the country before it does something. But I don't think so it's going to do something that drastic, but that has more of a hostility, or it's more volatile than the others. But South China Sea is more going to be but when North Korea does, that's the bad guy, and everybody has to come together to fight it. The problem with South China Sea is that even there is a division. ASEAN is divided. They don't know which side to take. So it's harder to take a decision and say, this is the problem and that we need to address, because you've not been able to come to a consensus on the problem itself. You don't know what the problem is. 50% says this is the problem, others says I better not get into it. So you're not being able to address it. North Korea, you're aware what the problem is, and most countries agree with it, and then you're trying to address that. But volatile because you have no control over that regime. So.
Quick question: what's Singapore's position on because Singapore, I'm assuming, uses the South China Sea, right? What's Singapore's position on the route?
So Singapore says that you have to abide by international rules and norms. So I mean, every country says you have to abide by international rules and norms, but then that's a statement. It's not something that is forcing you to or challenging what's happening on the ground. But Singapore is pretty concerned because right now they're also the chair of ASEAN from January this year. So but your personal your relationship does affect. I mean, Singapore just has been in I think they just had an agreement with China to use Hainan Islands to be able for their soldiers to train. Singapore is it's too small. They don't even have their military enough place to train. So they have agreements with Australia. They have agreements with China. Now they have an agreements with India to send their soldiers to train there and get that expertise. But Singapore is seen as this player who would be able to get in to kind of mediate this entire situation. The whole incident actually started in 2012 with this island called Scarborough Shoal, which was disputed between Philippines and China, and both had kind of deployed their navies there, and nobody was backing away. So US tried to mediate the entire situation and tried to be a mediator, and they came to an understanding that both China and Philippines would withdraw their forces and let the island be, and we'll discuss later. So Philippines withdrew, China withdrew, but within a few hours China came back and stopped Philippines from coming back. So by default it kind of took possession of the islands, and that became China's islands. So no arbitration or mediation has worked on this, although there is a lot of expectation that Singapore can play that part, but Singapore is not keen to play that part.
Yeah.
So, sure.
So I guess we're seeing in the Trump era, I guess not a whole lot of like written foreign policy coming out of America.
Right.
It's kind of more like
Tweets.
And also like I guess at the State Department, there's been a lot of turnover in staff, etc. And I guess like the whole platform and what Trump came in on was like make America great again, and let's take everything we're doing outside and bring it inside. Do you think there will be in the near future, do you think there will be a change in position by the US, or do you think there will be, I guess, less of a presence by the US in South China Sea in that dispute?
I don't US presence in the region that that it's just going to retreat, but I mean US in 2010 it was Hillary Clinton who talked about the rebalance strategy, that they're going to focus more on the Pacific and less on the Atlantic, because the Atlantic it's a much more stabilized region, and they started their rebalance whereby, well, by 2020 they would have 60% of the ships deployed to this part of the world, and it's underway. So, and from the numbers, the ships haven't been pulled out. So US, I mean, figuratively, it really hasn't declined, but its engagement and policy, if you ask the US Navy, it's a different story. If you ask the US administration, it's a different story. So the US is saying that, look, we'll provide the support. We're not going to be there all the time to carry your baggage. You have to come up and do it on your own. But then the US Navy, the Pacific Command, completely understands that, US needs to be physically present in this area. I don't see it completely declining, but I do see a role for other countries to pull up their socks and really take some of the initiatives, because there was, since Trump came in up until now, there was a lot of confusion on where US was going, and in the meantime things were escalating, and developments, they were not waiting for the US government to figure out where they are headed. So other countries had to take some initiatives and come together and start talking. So there has been much more collaboration between India, Australia, India, Australia, Indonesia, and several bilaterals and trilaterals come up simply because you just don't know which way US is going. So you're not sitting thinking US is going to do that, but it's still unclear where it's going to go. I mean, the US ambassador gave a speech yesterday, and he said, we're here, we're not going anywhere, but let's see how much of that comes through in actions.
Can I have a follow-up?
Sure.
To that? So I guess from an Australian perspective, we're kind of in a really interesting position. So much of our trade is with China and Asia, and yet we have this kind of historical intrinsic partnership with the US, which everyone on the forefront, everyone says based on shared values, etc.
Yeah.
But as both our countries are changing so much, it's less so. A lot of leading foreign policy writers, I'm sure you would have heard of Hugh White, they continuously are saying that we as Australians need to come to terms with the fact that our future is not going to be America, it's going to be China. And yet it's not happening on a social level so far. Do you, from an outside perspective, do you think that will change, or what are your thoughts? I
mean, the divide that I was talking about it's pretty much you is on the other side of the spectrum. Then you have your political sections, or Rory Metcalf, who's on the other side of the debate. But have you guys seen your white paper? It just came out. So that from I think the white paper from 2011 was a paper that had predicted most of these changes, and this one has a stark difference in tone in terms of what it means, Australia's perspective on the region. I think Australia was pretty clear that that this is a problem and Australia would have to balance it. But I think the way of balancing it is really engaging with more partners and going out of your traditional partners and reliance on them, and in fact creating more partnerships in the region to address this problem, because this is not going to go away. I mean, the influence, you see it happening in New Zealand, you see it happening in Maldives, where you have politicians who are being who are on different engagements with the Chinese. So the reason that even if strategically Australia understands the consequences of something like this, and politically it's not being able to take a decision, is because of this divide, that the fine balance between economics and strategic. But it's not just, it doesn't have to do it just because of US is doing pretty much the same. Every country would, you can't separate the two. You have to be able to find a way. So the new kind of response from the region has been to provide an alternative to this rising China by coming together and saying that if they might not be able to go into the South China Sea together as a show of force and say we don't want to abide by your rules, but they can come together and say these are the rules that we agree and this is what we are going to go by. So it's harder for one country to fight 6 big powers together as opposed to smaller individual nitpicking, right? So that's what they're trying to do, that in the Indian Ocean region, in the Indo-Pacific is an Australian construct. In the Pacific, this is the rules, these are the engagement, and we will abide by it. So if somebody wants to play, somebody wants to be present in here, this is what you'll have to follow.
What are your thoughts on having a shared superpower? So obviously last time that happened was US and Russia, and that didn't work out very well. But if China was allowed to become a greater power, because currently all the countries are in a bit of a confusion, they don't know what to do. But if China was allowed to have a greater presence, it might take more responsibility over the region, because I suppose right now it sees itself as all the other countries around it as allied to the US, and therefore it's being more provocative and hostile in its territory as it's expanding, trying to expand it. Do you think if it was allowed to be given more power, it would come with responsibility, and therefore it would feel less of a need to provoke its neighbouring its area? Like, do you think it's possible?
I mean, it's been debated, but China is not looking for anybody's permission to become great power. It said it in all of it, said that I'm going to be a great power, and I'm going to do what it needs for me to be a great power. I mean, China does not even want to displace the US. Its only competition is the US. It's not India. It's not. I mean, in India we do feel that we are on the other end of China's kind of competition, but for China, India is just a regional player that it needs to have a foothold in the Indian Ocean region to be able to compete with the United States, and in that India is a power, so it's an irritant. Its goal is really the US. It does not want to displace US. It does not want to displace any of the existing systems. It wants to create a parallel system. It wants to be at the same table as the United States. It wants to say that there are two great powers. It's US and China. And one system is, you have the you have the World Bank, you have the Asian Development Bank, which has primarily been championed by US and its allies. So now it's coming up with alternatives, right? It's coming up with Asian Infrastructure Investment Banks. It's coming up with parallel institutions where, US didn't want UK, its strongest ally, to be a part of AIIB. UK did sign up. Australia signed up to it. US asked all its allies, don't sign up to it, but you can't ignore it. So they're creating mechanisms and systems where it's going to be harder for people, for countries to be, to ignore that. So, it has charted out, what it's saying is 100 years of humiliation. It's my time to now rise and shine. And I think most countries have accepted that you cannot stop China because China is not asking you for your permission. You do not have the resource capability. You do not have the assets to stop China. What you have to figure out is, because of China's rise and the norms and rules that it's bringing with itself, it's changing the environment around it. So how do you manage that environment in which you still remain a relevant power and your interests are secured? So that is what most countries are still trying to figure out. And in terms of taking responsibilities, I mean, that's what China says, that all of the islands that it has built, it says that it's for humanitarian purposes. But at the same time, if you're not willing to, if you're not willing to kind of respect UN, or if you're not willing to respect dialogues, and because that's how the world has existed so far, right? It's on basis of these agreements. I mean, it can get derailed, but openly rejecting it, and openly saying that you are not valid, and that's completely new that has come into the picture. So it's actions like this that have questioned China's ability to do take responsibility that will address the region's interest as opposed to its own interest. So the concern is that if China comes to that level where it can impose rules and laws, that how much of it will actually be to serve the entire region and how much of it will just be for China. But that stands true for any superpower, but there are very thin lines in which, I mean, at this point China is also trying to get itself, validate its own position that I am important, so it's being hostile. But I don't know how things will play out in the Indian Ocean.
Just with the UN in the South China Sea, so if it gets to the Security Council, I'm presuming any physical action in there, China will probably veto.
Yeah.
And there's been debates about restructuring
The
Security Council and the power.
Yeah.
Do you think that this could actually trigger that restructure and the notion of veto?
I mean, there has been discussions and debates on, especially in the Security Council, on the reforms. So reforms, I think, will happen more. I mean, whether triggered by this or not, I think it's due. But at the same time, I don't think so you can keep China or any of its allies out of it, right? I mean, China is such a big player right now that it doesn't make sense for you to create a new system without its opinion, because it'll keep challenging you until you let it in. So the challenge really is to getting into the room and sitting down with China and coming to an agreement on how do you take forward from here. And that is what's not happening. Like I said, they say, there is no dispute, so I'm not going to resolve anything. How do you get past something like that? Do you come down with brutal force and say this is what it is going to be? Then you're talking about a conflict, an armed conflict. Or do you engage it even if there's a reform in the Security Council, China is going to be a part of it. And if it goes on the tracks that it is going on right now, then there's going to be, so there has to be repercussions to which it will have to be held on to, it'll have to be held accountable to, that it will have to respond to it. So like I said, I think it's not going to be easy for China to oppose 5, 6, a group of countries coming together and saying this is what we agree, because then it risks isolating itself, which is not something China wants either. So it will have to be coming together of these, like-minded countries and agreeing. But again, within that, there's so much politics that you barely get to an agreement, that easy. So it's going to take a while. It's going to evolve before we come to this, the foundations of the new architecture that we see in the horizon.
Just my question is, do you think domestic patriotism could shape the dynamics of the region? Because or bringing any kind of like rising risks to the region of the war. So in recent years, there's a rising patriotism both in China and Japan, right wing. The Philippines, the new president Duterte. And I don't know if this is the case in India. Rising patriotism. So what do you think?
So that always plays a role. I mean, that you ultimately you have to, while saying domestic concerns, you have to. It's politics, right? It boils down to votes. You have to adhere. You have to kind of play to your domestic crowd. I mean, for one of the concerns for India was like if India agreed to go on a patrol or deploy more ships in the South China Sea. I mean, the public is going to be like, they don't care about the South China Sea, the larger public, right? We are studying it, that's why we care about it. If it was Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Pakistan, which is our immediate neighbors, then you can understand. Indian public is going to question that when so many of the people are still in poverty and there is no education, why are you spending your resources in, addressing a concern that's so far away from your shores? And our defense budget is less than Australia's. Australia's 2%, we don't even need that. Ours is within the defense budget, the Navy gets the minimum. The Navy is the least that gets, because our main concerns are on the continental threats. So, and also similarly with, there was a time when Philippines stopped exporting bananas to China because of, thing. Then there was Chinese tourism was stopped to Philippines, and you have in Philippines where there were huge protests and they had said they won't buy any more Chinese cars, and then the similar thing in Japan. So there is that entire sense that comes out where you stop in fact trade for some time, or you stop tourism, you try and intimidate, but then you have to look back into the practicality and you have to restart and regain this. I mean, economics mostly trumps, but unless you are that big a power to kind of ignore it.
Just along that note, China's obviously still got a lot of domestic issues to sort out. How do you think that plays into its decision-making process in the South China Sea?
So for the South China Sea, like I said, it is, China is basically saying that, we have been denied our rights, and we have what belonged to us was forcefully taken away. We are now strong enough to defend it. And so it's for China, South China Sea, even for the domestic, it's a question of sovereignty and territorial rights. So it's not something that is negotiable for them. So it's not something that they think, can we give this away for a better gain? It's something, it's self-respect and pride that, it's ours. It's similar thing even in India, right? You see something and then it's like, no, we're not going to give that away to Pakistan, or we're not going to give that away to China. I mean, you have to defend it, and your public is not going to question it. Like, you don't want to be seen as that country who gets intimidated by bigger powers and, you give away what you think is yours. So South China Sea is a similar thing to China. It says that it's been with us since 1949. The problem is between 1949 and 2010, China did not have that kind of capability or power to do what it did after that. So it was quiet. everybody knew there was this 9-dash line, but China never stopped any ships from coming in, so nobody questioned it. It is in a domestic map of some country. It doesn't matter to me because it's not affecting my trade, it's not affecting my military communications, but now it's affecting, and that is why it's becoming. So the dispute is nothing new. The dispute is pretty old, but what is new is the new sense of, that 100 years of humiliation, it's my time now, we have to take back what was ours. So for South China Sea is not an area that I see can be negotiated even for domestic politics.
This is a bit unrelated to the South China Sea itself, but going off the question before, a lot of people seem to think like, China wants to be the superpower, and like there's this kind of view imposed on them almost, but like the actual narrative in China is really different. So like even the president said that rather than a zero-sum game, they aim to have a positive sum game where it's based on peaceful win-win situation and all that. So do you think the identity or do you think the rise of China discourse is kind of overstated and the identity is imposed on them by the Western world maybe? And do you think that they can actually take on that identity eventually?
I don't think so. China has said that it wants to be. I don't think that China has ever debated the thing that it wants to be a great power. It's pretty much said, I want to be a maritime power. I want to be a great power. But what it has said is what he said. It's all about win-win cooperation. It says that I want to be a great power, but as I go along in my path to becoming that great power, I will also take all of you with me. So if I'm developing, I'll make sure that you develop with me. So that is China's narrative. China is not saying that I don't want to. China is saying, I'm going to go get it, but with me, I'm going to take all of my friends, that if I'm developing, I'll help you develop. So I'm going to give you money to build your infrastructure. You can have better ports, better roads, better railways, better schools, things that the host country hasn't been able to do. You have governments who are struggling. Myanmar, you have governments who are struggling to build schools, villages. You have, roads are bad, but China comes in and says, hey, I have the surplus. I'm going to give it to you. Build your infrastructure. Give your citizens a better access to basic infrastructure like schools and hospitals. And they said, okay, that's great. You're taking me with it. But what really is the return for that? Something happened with Sri Lanka where the Chinese had given loan to the Sri Lankans to build this port, and the rates of interest are so high that Sri Lanka could never repay it. So the debt Sri Lanka currently is into China right now, it's going to take 3 generations of Sri Lankan citizens to repay that debt. And to avoid that, what Sri Lanka has done is leased that entire port to China for 99 years. That means that China owns property in another country's sovereign territory. So in that, you dock your submarines, you dock your ships. That's up to you. I mean, legally they can't do that because it would have to have Sri Lankan permission to come into those waters. But the fact is, China has access to that. China has resources in that. Similar thing has happened in Bangladesh. It's happened in Myanmar. It has happened in Maldives. There is a fear it's happening in Africa right now. That infrastructure creating infrastructure it's dual use. That even if it's commercial, it could have strategic gains. That even if China is saying it's for win-win cooperation, the whole One Belt One Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, that I'm going to build a road that is going to connect Europe to Southeast Asia, and it's great, it's ambitious, it's really great. But how are you building this? What project has really taken off under the Belt and Road Initiative? Not a single one. Everything is bilateral. Everything that has already existed has been put together under one umbrella. So it does not. So that is where the question comes, that if China was doing something that was for win-win cooperation, I mean, it's not like countries are not benefiting. They are benefiting, but quickly they're going into debts they have to repay. So in terms of actually infrastructure development, Japan has been the number one overseas development assistant they have provided to South Asia, as their reputations for their role in World War II. Since they become a pacifist country and they gave up, in their constitution, the war, that they went around creating a system in South Asia where they have given millions and millions of dollars in loans to South Asian countries to help socioeconomic, causes. But it never turned into debts in the way it's turning into debts for China. So that is the part. I don't think so. It's a profile that has been imposed on China. It is something that China owns it, that it wants to be a great power. The debate is on China's view of how it wants to become the great power, as opposed to what the West or the other countries are saying how it's actually going to achieve it.
I mean, going into debt but having better infrastructure, is that not a better trade-off? If the US can't help the countries in Myanmar and things like that build up their capacities, then going into debt but being able to provide for your citizens, is that...
You're going into debt because you're not being able to use that asset, right? Like they built an airport where Sri Lanka built this airport where there's no flights. It's empty, but you have to. So Sri Lanka has had to put money in to keep it running. There's not a single flight that goes in there. You're building stuff that is not necessarily. I mean, there are stuff like Sri Lanka's main expressway that connects their airport to the city. I mean, you go there, you've seen roads here. You go to Sri Lanka, you go to the countries where China's built roads. It's fantastic. It's you don't even realize how much they have done. But the rates of interest are so high that some either there are assets that resources that are not required or were not feasible. So the feasibility study was not done well. That it was more like a concession for giving me 2 roads, fine, maybe I'll give you these 2 extra ports that you can build, for which China has used, but it's the Sri Lankan economy who would have to pay to keep it running. So you can give that, you can give your citizens that better access, but if you'll have to recover that debt by increasing taxes or reducing somewhere else, I mean, what it really is the payoff there, right? So that's something that's playing a factor in the.
I have one question.
Sure.
It's a very interesting talk. What do you think of the role of Russia given the fact that Russia also has interests in the Pacific region? How does that get affected by this particular dispute?
I mean, Russia is the only country who's done live drill exercises with China in the East China Sea and South China Sea. I don't think so there's been any other country, but Russia stayed out of it. It's only engaged at the bilateral level. I don't think so, because the whole opposition thing has been led by US, so Russia's not been a part of the picture as yet, but it hasn't restricted its involvement or engagement with China on that.
And a second follow-up question in terms of prediction, risk prediction. What do you think are the best ways of interpreting this crisis in terms of research? Right? How do you make research more accurate to predict accurately? And what methods do you think would be most useful?
I think really going into the one is studying the pattern in which, because there is a pattern how China has kind of gone to, or what reaction it has generated from its actions. So everything it has done, from its history, when you look back into history and how it has talked about the Middle Kingdom and then the 100 years of humiliation and coming back, and then how the region has generated a response to it. So that gives you an idea of, if the next step is this, how the region is going to probably respond to it.
Mm-hmm.
So really studying the smaller details in the.
Some more questions. Okay. Do we have any follow-up questions? Anyone? Anyone wants to add something? I think most people have asked their questions. Okay. So very quickly, actually, just before we conclude, on behalf of
Thank you.
JGU, we have a small token of
Thank you.
appreciation. So, we have It's a scarf with all these cool kind
These are
of
the colours?
colours, yeah.
Okay, all right.
And this.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.